About Beethoven. So Chen Kui, what can you tell me about something you learned about Beethoven last week?
There's Beethoven's bibliography and his family works, symphony, sonata, and the string quartet.
Okay, so I think you meant biography. So biography is the life of a person. Yeah. Bibliography is all the publications. Yeah, I know, I make the mistake too. Yeah, a lot of people make that mistake. Not a big deal. When to something else about Beethoven.
I think the third period from the 1820 to 1887 is the most protective. A lot of the composition, the style in here is more expensive.
Yeah, the last period is the most experimental. This is the weirdest period. Generally something else. Okay, so Zheng Yu is pointing out a specific thing that I didn't talk about very much at all last week, and that has to do with the French Revolution and Napoleon and Beethoven's relationship to them. So a lot of composers in Europe were very interested and very supportive in the ideals of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was in part about democracy, or at least that's what it set up was. And so initially Beethoven and other composers were really big supporters of Napoleon and the overthrow of the aristocracy in France. And Beethoven thought that he would name the Third Symphony after Napoleon. But when Napoleon came to power, it turned out that he was really just a monstrous dictator. And all the ideals of the French Revolution pretty much get thrown out of the window, and Napoleon starts invading multiple European countries in order to expand France's borders. And as I mentioned to you last week, Beethoven was living in Vienna when Napoleon's forces invaded Vienna. And so at that point, Beethoven and lots of other people, really did a retake and realized that Napoleon was actually really evil. So how could he name a piece after Napoleon? And so that's when he came up with the nickname Eroica. It was sort of generally meant to represent something that was heroic and not Napoleon specifically. Elena, something else we learned last week.
We learned that most of his popular music was actually written in that second period from 1803 to 1814.
Yeah, the stuff where lots of people were playing his music comes from that start of the third period. Bailey, something else you learned last week about Beethoven?
Something that we talked a lot about was how his pieces reflect a lot of the struggle in his own life as in the dramas, which was like a new concept at that time.
Yeah. Okay, so this is something that the textbook talks about quite a lot. In fact, the textbook essentially offers an interpretation of the first movement of the Third Symphony that is very evocative. Instead of talking about forms and themes, which is what I was doing, that is, I was talking about the structure of the piece, the textbook talks about the meaning of the piece. And based on a lot of archival work, it's generally assumed that the meaning of the piece has to do with confronting various personal battles. Okay, now when I write test questions, I really try to look for and ask about objective information, not subject information. So if you look at the study guide, you'll see that there's no reference to what the textbook has to say about the meaning of the Eroica. And that's simply because I'm just not going to test on something that's subjective, that might change over a period of time. I don't think it will, but I think the actual physical characteristics of the music are more important for you at this stage. Great to point that out though, Bailey. Simpa, something else about Beethoven that you learned? Excellent. Emily, did you get caught up after IMEA? What's one of the things you got caught up on?
The textbook noted that he experimented with the new seniority of strings playing pitch staccato across the full texture rather than just one instrument.
Yes. And so one of the things that we talked about when you were at IMEA or going to IMEA was this idea that the last period is the most experimental. Everything gets experimented on. Really nice point. Is Sam here?
Yeah.
Okay. So Sam, what can you tell us?
Apparently Beethoven was really good at improvising on the piano, which is something I did not know at all. I thought he was composition.
Okay, so this is one of the big things that is probably not stressed enough in music history classes, but throughout music history, Western music history, even through the 19th century, improvisation was really important. Like some musicians, even people who have got graduate degrees, somehow think improv is a jazz property. But in fact, prior to the 20th century, it was expected that if you were a performing musician, you would be able to improvise. So the big name pianists could all improvise. Mozart was a stunning improviser. Mozart would do things like improvise entire operatic scenes and entire piano sonatas. And we think he actually composed more piano sonatas than he actually ever wrote down. So Beethoven's just continuing this tradition that believed that improvisation was just one of those really important aspects of being a musician. It wasn't some, special skill that only a few people would have. Joe, something else you learned last week?
Yeah, I learned that Beethoven couldn't catch a break from 1853 to 19. He was beginning to become deaf, and then his brother died, and he thought that he was going to be taking his brother's son, and then he has this huge custody battle with his brother's wife, and it takes a huge toll on his mental health.
Yeah, okay, so basically those particular years were very troublesome. But I have to point out that the rest of his life was not exactly easy either. Just having to deal with his deafness, he was constantly experimenting with the latest technology. People were coming up with ideas about hearing aids. At one stage, he experimented with a type of horn, really large horn that was attached to the piano that pushed the sound towards him so he could try and hear more of the piano notes. None of these things worked very well. He was always frustrated when he tried to communicate with people. People would come to see him, but he couldn't hear them, so he would have them write down questions in conversation books, which we still have. But imagine how frustrating it is. You have somebody who's sitting there writing, you're sitting there, and then you have to listen, and then finally you get around to responding. That's not a cool way to be able to interface with people. And this was somebody who had always found it difficult to really interact with people in a meaningful way. So the deafness really just made his anxiety even worse. Hey, Julia. Something else.
Talk about how some of the modal stuff he did, especially the third movement, a lot of it was inspired by Palestrina, which was like becoming, or it was like resurging in that era.
Excellent. Really nice point to pick up on. Quickly, something else.
He loves the use of contrast, so whether it be with dynamics or mood changes, especially with their style changes, sometimes composition moves, especially.
Yeah, so the contrasting becomes really crucial in the third period. And that's when you're getting lots and lots of contrast within an individual movement. So you're getting constant contrast coming at you really, really quickly. Jared, something else?
He would like to challenge amateur instrumentalists in the early days by putting super easy passages right next to really difficult ones.
Sorry?
Going off of the contrast that he put in his pieces, he used that to sort of go against what people knew sonata form as, because we talked about how in the classical period, sonata form was meant to be like symmetrical and create balance and clarity. And through the contrast he created
up since going to IMEA?
Not on Thursdays, but on Tuesday we talked about how we studied with Haydn and Albrechtsberger, and it really challenged his music and made it evolve and taught him new things about counterpoint.
Okay, great. Christian, was there something in the book that I didn't talk about in class? Christian? Yeah. Oh, actually, lots of these things that I didn't talk about in class. So, you have a lot of options here.
I can't think of
Okay, Madeline, something that you read about that I didn't talk about in class?
They talked about a lot of his like dance music and ballet music that he wrote, which I don't know if I touched on. Let me for a second. That's specifics. I'd also mentioned how Beethoven found writing opera really difficult and kind of gave up on it. So that's
Yeah.
why we don't.
Okay, so Beethoven did write one opera. The opera is called Fidelio. It's actually influenced by French operas. And the premiere of the opera was scheduled, but that premiere coincided with the French invading Vienna. And so by that time, all the people who would normally go to an opera, and especially a premiere of Beethoven's opera, like all the wealthy, educated people, had left Vienna because they knew the French were coming. So it didn't get a very good audience. And it turned out there were just problems with the music, there were problems with the dramatic flow. So he worked on revising it multiple times. He wrote 3 different overtures with it until he was happy with one. And so, yeah, this is something he really struggled with. It's sort of ironic to me because his instrumental work is so dramatic. You would think that he would be a natural going into a dramatic genre, but it just wasn't easy for him at all. Okay, where's Molly? Molly is 6 today. And Carter? Okay, anything you can tell us we haven't talked about already?
publishers would have to compete to be able to publish his music. So he would miss deadlines a lot, but he didn't really care because he wanted to be perfect.
Yeah, if you're really a genius, you can get away with a lot of stuff. Okay, and there's Emmanuel here. Okay, good work. Okay. So if you haven't already done so, could you take a photograph of this so that you have an idea of what you're meant to be reading before Thursday? And this is also on the study guide for Module 2. So Module 1 was just Beethoven, and now we're into Module 2, and we're doing the first half of Module 2. Today we're talking about Hensel, Lieder, and Mendelssohn and Oratorio. I think about half of you, maybe a bit over half of you, have already chosen research paper topics. If you want to start working on your research paper topic, the first thing you need to do is create a mini bibliography, and the instructions for the mini bibliography are in Module 3. And you're welcome to go and start working on that. All of the instructions you need are in that prompt. Okay, everyone got a photo? Okay. So this is the order of events. I'm going to define the genre called Lieder. Then we're going to look at a Lied, one by Fanny Hensel. Then we're going to talk about the biography of Fanny Hensel and her brother Felix Mendelssohn. And then we're going to look at a choral work by Mendelssohn. Okay, so firstly, Lied. So this is a German word, and it refers to German songs. Lied, L-I-E-D, is one song. Lieder, E-R on the end, makes it plural. So Lieder are songs. So there's no such thing as leads. It's either Lied or Lieder. And Lied just means song. And throughout most of Western history, it basically referred to something that was like a folk song. Composers had been writing lieder since the late Middle Ages. These were secular pieces, they were folksy pieces. When the piano gets invented in the 18th century, Mozart and Haydn and their colleagues start writing lieder with piano accompaniment. But in their lieder, the piano is really just there to support the voice. And Mozart and Haydn didn't write very many lieder at all. It was just an occasional thing they did. Now this changes in the first decade of the 19th century when composers start making lieder a much more artistic genre. So from the 19th century onwards, a lied is a voice for piano and voice. A lied is a piece for piano and voice. The piano and voice are equally important. And the general concept, what makes a lied special, is that the composers made every effort to match their music onto the words. And we often refer to the words as the text of the song. So there are a lot of text-music relationships. Okay, so to write a lied, the first thing you need is the text, and a text is a pre-existing poem. Since we're talking about German composers, these texts are normally in German. So one of the reasons that lieder becomes such an elevated art form in the 19th century is that in literature, there's a flourishing of German Romanticism. There's just a whole generation of people who were considered to be brilliant poets. So these are some of the main poets of German Romanticism: Goethe, Heine, Eichendorff, Tieck. All of them were famous in their own right as poets. Now, today, you might be somebody who's very well read. You read a lot of what's going on in the press. You read serious books, but you might not crack a book of poetry at all. But in Germany in the 19th century, if you were a well-educated citizen, you would know all about German poetry. It was considered to be an important part of the culture. Okay, so there are a lot of lieder with poems by these main guys, but in fact a composer could choose any poet at all. So some of the composers had friends who were poets. They weren't particularly good poets, but the composers thought, you know, they're my friend, I like them, I'm helping them out. So they would choose a poem by somebody who's not famous at all. In some cases, the poems were originally written in another language. For instance, German Romantic poets really liked the work of the Scottish poet Robert Burns. And while some people could read Robert Burns in the English language, Burns's poetry was also translated into German. So there are composers who took the German translations of Burns's text and set them to lieder. There are also Italian, Spanish poems, even Persian poems that were translated into German and then used as lieder texts. During the Romantic period, there was a really great interest in folk song. This came about because of industrialization. That on the one hand, industrialization offered a lot of opportunities. On the other hand, industrialization was often seen as a negative thing, because industrialization pushed people out of farms and living in small villages, and they came to the cities to earn a living in the newly created industries. And often their livings were not that good. I mean, it was low income jobs, not great housing conditions. And some intellectuals just saw this movement as being a movement away from the beautiful countryside into urban living, which they saw as being full of evil and challenges. So they looked back nostalgically to the time when more people were living on the land. Now remember, when you're being nostalgic, you're using rose-colored lenses. You look back at something in the past and you forget all its negatives and only view the positives. So when these people looked longingly at the past, they'll say things like, life was so simple there, you could enjoy the beauty of nature, yada, yada, yada. And in fact, that's not true at all. You know, life in rural times before the 19th century was really incredibly difficult. Living for especially people who were poor, they were not great living conditions either. You weren't getting any sort of education, and there was not a lot of ability to move from one class to another. But nevertheless, intellectuals who were opposed to industrialization looked back at envy with this old style of life because it was closer to nature. So they associated folk song with the oldest style of life. And so there are lots of people throughout Europe who collected folk songs and who published them. And they'd publish either just all the texts, or sometimes they'd publish the texts with the melodies. So composers could sort of get into this nostalgic movement by taking the text of a folk song and setting it to music to create a lieder. Not using the original music, but creating new music. So in general, basically any poem has the potential to be used and turned into lieder. Okay, so here are some of the composers. These four, yeah, Tori.
Do they always translate it to German though, like all of these?
Yeah, lieder is a specifically German genre.
Okay.
So there are genres in other countries that attempted to have similar characteristics, but they were largely influenced by lieder, and they would write in their own language. But sometimes they'd actually write lieder in the German language. There's actually some American composers in the 19th century living in America, speaking English, but they really like lieder and they write in the German language. It's a bit of a mix. Okay, so these are the main composers, Schubert, Schumann, Brahms, and Wolf, and I've arranged them in chronological order. So Schubert is writing Lied in the 19 teens. He dies in 1828. So he's writing in the 18 teens into 1828. He dies when he's about 30. Okay, so his creative life is pretty much cut short. He is the first composer who really wrote a huge amount of lieder. He wrote something over 600 lieder. And a lot of his income was generated from lieder, from publishing lieder and selling it to amateurs. And so here's the one that's really credited with moving lieder to a professional artistic level. So Schumann, some of Schumann's best lieder are written in the 1840s. Brahms is writing lieder from the 1850s through the 1890s. He dies in 1897. So all the second half of the 19th century. And then Hugo Wolf, he started becoming famous as a lieder composer in the 1880s. He composing in the 1890s, and then he went insane. Okay, so this covers the entire 19th century. All of these guys are guys. Women also wrote and published Lieder. Three of the better women-known composers are Fanny Hensel, who we'll look at, Clara Schumann, who you looked at in Music History 200, and Josephine Milan. And women were writing Lieder in part because there were a lot of women who were at home performing Lieder. With Schubert's generation at the start of the 19th century, Lieder was thought of as a domestic genre, something that you would hear in informal concerts at home, or if you were a pretty good amateur musician, you would also be able to perform Lieder. And most of the people who were performing Lieder at home were women. So it's natural that they got the idea they could compose Lieder, and some of them actually published their Lieder. Okay, so if you're going to write a song that you're going to create text-music relations with, you need to know a lot about the poem that you've selected. Composers in their letters indicated to us that they really spend a lot of time learning the poems that they set to music. And that meant things like reading the poems out aloud so that they could hear what the words sounded like. And I don't mean just reading like 100 miles an hour to get to the end as quickly as possible, but essentially reciting it in a very dramatic way. So some words would get more emphasis than another. There'd be pauses sometimes. And then the composers actually had to analyze the poetry. So one of the first things that work out through their analysis is the form that they were going to use. There are a lot of different forms, but these are the three most common. So a strophic lead is where each stanza has the same music. Each stanza of the poem has the same music. Okay, sounds simple enough. Lots of pieces other than Lieder use strophic form. You know, nursery rhymes, lots of pop songs, church hymns are usually strophic. The thing about strophic Lieder is, remember the principle that the music has to match onto the text. That means that the music you write has to match up onto multiple different stanzas. So say I take a poem about a beautiful rose, and the first stanza describes the beauty of its perfume, and the second stanza describes the beautiful color, and then the third stanza talks about its depth. That's not going to work as a strophic setting, because the third stanza has a different meaning to the other two. To write a strophic song, the stanzas need to be roughly the same length. So each stanza needs to have roughly the same number of lines. Okay, so strophic variation, essentially each stanza of music is roughly based on the first. Each stanza of music is roughly based on the first. Essentially, the composer makes changes in each stanza of music so that it maps onto the corresponding words. So he changes that first stanza of music to match onto the words of the subsequent stanzas. Okay, so my silly example about the rose. I could write one stanza of music and use it for the how nicely the rose smells, and use the same music for the next stanza, and then take that music and change it for the stanza about the rose dying. So you can imagine the first two stanzas are maybe in major, so I could basically take that music and turn it into minor for the death. I probably would add some dissonances and drama. It's also possible that you can really recompose the phrases. So it might be that I take the first phrase of the original stanza and then write really new music, but then end the same way. But whatever changes the composer makes from one stanza to another, those changes have to be cued to the meaning of the words. Okay. When a composer reads the poem, one of the things they pay attention to is the punctuation. Because you want the punctuation to line up with the cadence points. And the strength of your cadences are likely cued to the punctuation. So just think of this very commonsensically, that you're going to have a more solid cadence with a period than you're going to have with a comma. Now, depending on what the words are actually saying, maybe a composer will insert a rest after a comma, or a couple of rests after a period. So the punctuation is also linked into what the voice is doing. Sometimes the composers looked at the rhyming scheme, came up with melodic shapes to match onto the rhymes. Now the tricky thing is declamation. Okay, so declamation is the relationship between the rhythm of the voice part, and the rhythm of the words. How many of you did poetry at school or in some sort of university core class? Okay, so when you did poetry at school, did you learn anything about accented syllables? Dying out of poetry. Okay, so essentially, just like we think of meter as having combinations of strong and weak beats, poets think of words as having accented syllables and unaccented syllables. And just like we have duple meter, triple meter, quadruple meter, and so on, there are specific meters that poets use over and over again. The general principle is that an accented syllable should line up with an accented beat. An accented syllable should line up with an accented beat. Okay, this is actually not very complicated. This is something that folk songs almost always do. And in fact, composers first learned how to write lieder by looking at folk songs and looking for things like the relationship between the melody and the rhythm and the words. So those early composers like Schubert and Schumann, this is the type of declamation they used. The last composer I talked about, Hugo Wolf, Wolf comes right at the end of the 19th century, and he was part of a group of German composers who believed that the rhythm, even the longs and the shorts of the rhythmic patterns of a melody, should match up with the rhythm of the words. So instead of just looking at the accents, they considered the lengths of syllables. Okay, so whether you like it or not, and whether you've thought about it or not, all of us use rhythm when we speak. some of the syllables we say take, no time at all. But because of the vowels, other syllables take longer. So saying hi, that's a really short vowel. But saying hello, that takes more time because the ha part is a longer syllable. And so Wolf believed that a composer would really factor that in when they wrote the actual short and long rhythmic patterns for an entire melody. And finally, what's word painting? You guys did some word painting in 200, and you might have even done some with Dr. Stein. What's the definition of word painting? Yeah.
Matching words like down or up to like the music of like relating notes, like making passages like go lower or go higher.
Yeah. Okay. So word painting is thought of as a graphic device. You're going to a specific measure, you're looking at a specific word, you're thinking, what does that word mean? And then the music around it portrays the meaning. So any sort of direction like height is really easy for word painting. But then building on that, death, grave is often portrayed as being much lower pitches. So there's an arsenal of word painting that you can use. So composers use a lot of word painting. They use harmonies very carefully. To them, harmonies and specifically dissonances are expressive devices. Okay, so I asked you to download Hensel's song and also the translation of the text. If you could pull those out for me. Okay, so the poet here is Nicholas Lenau. You can see that he lived in the first half of the 19th century. He was highly respected in the first half of the 19th century while he was alive. But after that he died, people were not so into his poetry, in part because they thought this was too dark and too depressive. So he himself had a very depressive personality. He had lots of problems trying to build relationships. He really wanted a relationship with a woman, and he just couldn't get anyone to work. He got so disillusioned with Germany that he actually migrated to the United States and then got completely disillusioned here and went back to Germany. He attempted suicide several times. And in 1844, he was institutionalized because of his psychological breakdown. So it's perhaps not surprising that his poems often deal with melancholy and loneliness. A lot of them deal with nature, especially the German forest, and also night. Now, the thing about German Romantic poetry is sometimes poems aren't about what they see. So a poem about a bird called a nightingale, talking a lot about a nightingale, you might think, okay, it's just about this bird. But in fact, it's about unrequited love. Since the Middle Ages, the nightingale had symbolized unrequited love. And so in Lenau's painting, often mentions of elements of nature, like night, are being used to create an atmosphere or to convey emotions. Okay, so Alana, you've got a really good voice. Could you read the English translation? You don't need to tell us that Stephen translated it for us, but just the English translation. And while she's reading the poem, the rest of you work out, what does it mean? And I'll ask you to explain the meaning of it to me once we've heard it. So, Lana.
Linger on me, your eye of darkness. Exercise your power in full, solemn, mild, dream-laden, unfathomably sweet night. With the magic of your darkness, take this world away from me, so that you hover over my life all alone forever and ever.
Anybody want to jump in? What does it mean? Or what sort of emotions do you think are being portrayed? Yeah.
Depression.
Yeah, it's definitely really depressed. So the darkness thing, the darkness is sort of two things. On the one hand, it's night, but it's also this sort of depressive mood. Yeah.
Also, he seems frustrated with the dark emotions. It's like mad at himself about it.
Yeah, there is something that this person feels powerless to do something. They're not happy with their condition, and they feel as if whatever condition, their status quo is just never going to change. Anybody else want to add anything? Yeah. Hopeless, yeah, that's a really good idea. Okay, so I'm going to play through the music, so you need to be following along with your score. And I'll leave the translation up here to help you out. And so when you've heard the music, I'm going to ask you to show me some text-music relationships. So that means take me to a specific measure, tell me what the words are, and then what is the music doing around those words. So, any part strike you as particularly interesting or particularly expressive? Yeah.
On the words that translate to darkness, there's use of accidentals and also like a lower pitch, like descending.
Yeah. Okay, so the second full measure, and it's actually the first accidental in the piece at F natural on the word dark. So, what's the key of the piece?
It seems to be in A flat major first, I think, and then near the end here it goes to A flat major.
Yeah. Okay, so if you just look at the key signature, you look at the opening and and then you look at the end, it screeches A flat major. But in the bulk of the song, there's lots and lots of accidentals, and those accidentals are minor borrowings. And so that's where the song is moving towards A flat minor. So there's this really tension between the outer ends of the piece and actually the bulk of the piece. Other things to talk about. Anybody find any word painting?
Forever and ever, the feed and feed is the longest rhythmic duration of the whole piece. Forever is a dotted half note, which is not seen again. So it's really dragging out forever and ever.
Yeah, so this is here and also here. So the text is talking about forever, and so she goes for a longer rhythmic value.
Building on that, it also like slows down each time those end phrases repeat. Like when they keep repeating the fear and fear are like the first phrase or the first verse of that. It slows down each time.
Yeah. Okay, so the thing about these text-music relationships is when we're analyzing a leader and focusing on the text-music relationships, we're focusing on what the composer did. So that means what's written into the score. So what you were talking about was a performance nuance, which I think actually most performers would have done, but it's not the sort of thing that we would normally focus on when we're analyzing a lead because the composer didn't write it into the text, even though it seems like an obvious thing to do, and his singers probably did so. Okay, notice a lot of those accidentals, they're not only giving you a minor shading, they're creating dissonances. And there are lots and lots of dissonances in this piece. There are very few standard cadences. They're all interrupted by dissonances. So what sort of cadence do you normally expect a song to end on? Yeah, like a pack, a 5-1. But notice there's not a 5-1 here. Instead there's a playful cadence, there's a 4-1. Now sometimes a lead might end with a 4-1, but then as the piano finishes, a composer would add in a dominant chord so you get a 5-1. Here there's no dominant chord. So the entire song lacks a structural, authentic cadence. And that gives it, that lack of the cadence contributes to the sort of floating feel. Right? The piece is hovering, which is what the text describes. Okay, so this is sort of representative of what a lead composer is trying to do, to create these relationships between the text and the music. You don't have to have a lot of overt word paintings, but certainly a lot of the harmonies, the dissonances, in this case, the movement between major and minor keys, are conveying the mood and the structure of the text. So now let's move to the composer herself. And this would also be fair game on a test. So Fanny Hensel belonged to a very famous, very wealthy family in Germany called the Mendelssohns. She had 3 siblings, but she was closest to her brother Felix. Essentially, Fanny and Felix grew up together. They had the same sort of education. The family had private homeschooling, but homeschooling on a rather expensive scale. They had lots of different expert tutors come into the house. The kids learned languages, they learned dance, they learned science and math, and they got lots of music lessons. So their mother, whose name was Leah, was a really decent amateur musician. She had actually studied with a student of J.S. Bach. And because she'd studied with a student of J.S. Bach, she actually knew a lot of Bach's music and really admired Bach's music. And her children learned Bach's music, even at an early age. Now, some of you probably think that that's not a big deal because you've been hearing about Bach in Music History 200 and Music History 330, maybe even in your theory classes. But at the start of the 19th century, you could be a very educated musician and actually know next to nothing about Bach. So it's really unusual that they should have a musical education that really emphasized Bach. It turned out that both of them were highly accomplished pianists, and they both learned how to compose. However, when they hit puberty, their father decided to, pretty officially say that it would be fine if Felix wanted to be a professional musician, but Fanny could not be a professional musician. He claimed that what Fanny should do is to, have a husband of her own, and her most important thing to focus on would be her family life. And we know about this because he wrote this down in a letter. So he was fine with having her study music. He was fine with her learning how to compose and write her own music. He was fine with her performing at home for friends or the family. She just couldn't be paid for any sort of work. Now, in addition to being concerned about what a woman should do, what a woman's focus should be, her father was also somewhat concerned about how the family was perceived by the outside world. So in Germany in the 19th century, it was expected that women of the upper class would definitely not work. The sort of preconception was, if you're from the upper class, you have a lot of wealth, why would you work? And if you did work, is that actually telling the world that your family doesn't have a lot of money? I mean, you can see all the false misconceptions adding up here. So if you were a woman in a lower class family, you actually probably did work because your family needed money. If you were a woman in a middle class family, it really depended on your attitude, your family's attitude to whether you're permitted to work. But upper class, you can't work. They were from the upper class, and they were very famous. And her father just didn't want to bring any sort of negative attention to the family at all. Now, the Mendelssohns were phenomenally wealthy. This is their house. And we're only seeing the front of it. It actually goes back quite a lot. It had a private garden, and it had a room large enough to host small concerts, so, with 100 people or so. And every Sunday, the mother, Leah, would host private concerts. And by private, I mean you could only go there if you were invited. And she would bring some of the best musicians from around Europe to come and perform in these private concerts. Both Felix and Fanny performed in these concerts. Fanny could do that because she wasn't earning any money, and it was in the family's house. Fanny had her own compositions performed in these concerts. These concerts were actually quite famous, even though they were private events. if you were in the upper class and part of the set that really liked music, literature, and art, you really wanted an invitation to these events. So all sorts of big name people showed up, including the poet Goethe. He went to one of these concerts, and he just happened to go to a concert where both Fanny and Felix played. And he wrote in his recollections about hearing them play. And he was incredibly impressed by both of them. He thought both of them were phenomenal musicians. But he said, I think that Fanny is better than Felix. Is a better pianist. And in fact, there were similar reports by a few other people who heard both of them play. Now, eventually, Leah, their mother, dies, and Fanny takes over the organization of these concerts. And even though Fanny married, she stayed living in the same house. Her husband came to live with her in this monstrous house, and they raised their children there. And so she staged all these concerts. So essentially, a lot of the pieces that she was writing was with the idea of having the pieces performed in these concerts. So she's writing small-scale pieces like lieder, solo piano works, a little bit of chamber music. Okay, so in all she writes over 400 works, but only 61 of them were published in her lifetime. And there's only a small number of them published in her lifetime because to her father, being a professional composer meant you published your compositions. So since she wasn't allowed to be a professional composer, she wasn't allowed to publish her compositions. It seems that her mother actually had more liberal ideas and thought maybe this was okay, but for whatever reason didn't want to make a big scene with her father. Felix's attitude, it's a little bit hard to read. He wrote comments that were a little bit contradictory. So she starts writing lieder when she's relatively young in 1814. She publishes her first lied in 1825, but her name is not on the score, so that's sort of okay. Then in 1826 and 1827, Felix publishes 2 collections of his own songs, opuses 8 and 9. And within these opuses 8 and 9, there are 6 songs by Fanny. But all of them are published under Felix's name. It seems that Fanny was completely okay with this. She participated in all aspects of the publication process. In fact, some people believe that she had more of a hands-on attitude to the preparation of the scores for the publisher than what Felix did. Okay, now in the 19th century and even before that, it was not unusual for women to release their creative work to the public under men's names. This is something that women writers of fiction and poetry routinely did. They used a men's name because they thought it would get published easily and it would be more readily acceptable. Some of them who were not doing this for an income, but just sort of sporadically, would publish under the name of a relative. And the Mendelssohns did know another brother and sister where the sister published a few things under her brother's name. So this was not really an unusual thing to do. These lieder were these lieder by Felix were very popular in the 19th century. When Felix went to England, he went to England quite a lot. He was very popular there. He performed some of his works for Queen Victoria. And he met with Queen Victoria after the concert, and she sang one of his lieder to him. She sang one of the songs from these 2 opuses. It was actually not by him, it was one of Fanny's songs. So Queen Victoria had the entire 2 collections. She'd gone through all the works. The song she liked the most turned out to be one by Fanny. And so Felix told her, you know, not really my song, my sister's song. And then the story has made it into all of their biographies. Fanny marries a painter, then her father dies. She publishes 2 lieder on her own, but then with her husband's support and Felix's support, she starts publishing more pieces in 1846 and 1847. It seems that right around this time she gets much more confident as a composer, and when she was more confident, she was more happy with the idea of sending her songs out to the public and having them reviewed in music journals. But notice the year she dies, 1847. Okay, so she's just got to the point where she can believe that she can be a professional composer, and she dies. So her career is cut short. Her husband, who has been supporting her all the way along, he really wanted her to compose and to publish. He publishes some of her works after her death, but even then, in the 19th century, less than half of her works were published. Now, as the women's liberation movement in the 1960s became more powerful, scholars started studying more and more women's compositions. And this is when scholars throughout the world started sort of getting interested in Fanny Hetzel's music. And then after the Black Lives Matter movement really took off, the Black Lives Matter movement had a spillover effect on women composers, regardless of color. Suddenly, people were thinking that they absolutely had to perform more diverse repertoire. And so suddenly Fanny's works are getting many, many more performances. There are many, many more recordings. She is now included in textbooks like yours. I chose to talk about her lead. Your anthology actually has a piano piece by her, a really virtuosic piano piece by her. The only reason why we're not studying that piano piece is that we're studying a heap of other piano pieces, and I thought you should look at some other type of genre as well. And music theorists have really got involved in looking at her work and analyzing her work in detail, analyzing it in much more detail than what we did with that song. And what they realized very quickly was that even though Felix and Fanny were very good composers, they had very different styles. And it was Fanny who was much more adventurous and even experimental than Felix. So all those dissonances and the chromaticism that we saw in that song, there's nothing comparable to that in Felix's works. And even if you look at other leader composers of the same time period, she is among the most dissonant composers of the 1840s. So really interesting backstory to her, and somebody who's really impacted by society's standards and customs for women. Okay, so we're going to take a quick look at Felix. In your anthologies, I'm on page 488. Okay, so Felix is pretty much a workaholic. He was not only a very accomplished and very successful composer, he was also a widely appraised conductor. And he was pretty much constantly on the road with various conducting gigs. And not only in Germany, but he was also very successful in England and spending a lot of time over there. Because he was a professional musician, he was writing large-scale works because he could get performances of large-scale works, something that his sister could never have done. So he writes symphonies and overtures, he writes a lot of complicated chamber music, and he writes oratorios. Okay, so in your earlier music history courses, you found out what an oratorio is. So who can remind me what an oratorio is? So in 200, you listened to Handel's Messiah? So what's an oratorio? Yeah.
Sacred piece with voice and
Yeah, excellent. It's a sacred piece, runs about 2 hours. It's got a full orchestra, big chorus, lots of choruses, and also solos. And from the late Baroque through the classical period, the solos are recitatives and highly ornamented arias. Okay, now because Mendelssohn had been introduced to Bach when he was still young, he got really interested in Bach's oratorios. And he also got interested in Handel's oratorios, not only because Handel was a contemporary of Bach, but because when Mendelssohn went to England, he found out that the English, even in the 19th century, loved Handel's choral works. So in the 19th century, in the United States and also throughout Europe, one of the things that a lot of people did with their leisure time was to sing, and specifically join amateur choruses. So there's a huge amount of choral work that's written in the 19th century. There's lots of different types of choral pieces, from little short pieces for all men's voices or all women's voices, to really long pieces like oratorios and masses. And so writing an oratorio is essentially tapping into the popularity of choral music. And the idea was that these oratorios would be performed by amateur choruses. You bring in professionals to do the solos, but the choral parts, which are actually really important, are sung by amateur choruses. And so when Mendelssohn decides to write oratorios, he's heavily influenced by Handel and Bach. So when you read about St. Paul in your anthology, you're wanting to find out which things show the influence of Handel and Bach and which elements are more modern. Because he's not just simply writing Baroque sounding music, he's taking ideas from those composers and marrying them to 19th century stylistic elements. Okay, so you need to know how to spell Felix Mendelssohn. For the purpose of a test, just call it St. Paul. This is the story of Paul's conversion. I think in Music 330 you listen to a short vocal piece by the German composer Schutz. Emily, is that so? Yeah. And it's from the same scene where Paul is, the character that's called Saul, is converted to Christianity, and he subsequently takes the name Paul. So it's a very, very dramatic moment. So I'm just going to point out a few things that show you the different styles. So on the bottom of page 488, when the voices enter, that melody is in the style of a German Lied. It's sort of lyrical, but it's mostly syllabic. So this is different to what Bach and Handel would do. A Bach aria or a Handel aria has a lot of coloratura, so a lot of ornaments. This is much plainer. Okay, now go to page 491. Notice we've got a really large orchestra, much larger than what Bach or Handel would normally do. But look at the string and the timpani part. Notice that tremolo there? This is not something that you'd see in a Baroque composition. So the tremolo, and specifically the tremolo written out in the timpani, is 19th century. Go to page 496. Okay, so Mendelssohn, because he's a conductor, he is really familiar with the orchestra, what all the instruments can do, what are the latest improvements in instrumental technology. So if you run down your eye, down the list of the instruments, notice that he's got trombones. Bach and Handel wouldn't use trombones. And then if you look under where it says fagotto, it says serpent and contrafagotto. So he wants a serpent and the contrabassoon. This is a serpent. The serpent dates back to the medieval Renaissance time. It's a sort of hybrid instrument. The mouthpiece is like the mouthpiece on a brass instrument. It's made of brass and it has that same cup-like shape. But the rest of the instrument is more like a woodwind instrument. So you can see the holes in the wood. And the reason that it's curvy is because they wanted a really low bass instrument. But obviously a really big long bass instrument, if it's just one long piece of wood, it becomes really difficult to finger the notes. So having this curvy shape actually made it easier to play. This is not an instrument a normal 19th century composer would have. So this is somewhat of an oddity. It's likely he wanted it because he really wanted in various places to get a really low, strong bass. So having the serpent double the contrabassoon makes it much, much louder. You know, better balance with what everybody else is doing. Okay, and then really quickly, two more things. A lot of the phrases start imitatively and end homophonically. So phrases that start imitatively and then end homophonically, that's the way Handel writes for chorus. And then on page 507, page 507 is the start of a fugue. So the fugal writing here is much more the influence of Bach. Okay, so when you come in on Thursday, I'm going to start here and I'll ask you some questions about Hensel and Mendelssohn, just like we did today. Make sure you have done the reading on both and read what the anthology says about Mendelssohn and the reading that's up on canvas about Hensel. You need to read Hensel's bio that's in the Grove, and then we'll go from there. Okay, stay warm, and I'll see you on Thursday. And good work on Beethoven this morning. Like flop around?
No. No, I don't. Are you talking about what you showed me earlier? Yeah. Here lately. Tell you what.